So this afternoon, we're joined by Representative Spencer Wetmore, District 115 down in Charleston County. Representative Wetmore, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, to start off with, you are the incumbent representative in District 115, but you have a bit of a unique background story to becoming the incumbent. So if you would just kind of share with our members a little bit about how you got into the House this year.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, just barely an incumbent. We had a special election. So Representative Peter McCoy held this seat up until this year. And when he left to become U.S. Attorney for South Carolina, it set off a chain of events that led to a special election in August. So I was actually elected in August. I went up to the legislature, I went up to Columbia for 2 weeks in September. They had to show me how to vote on the first day, so I wouldn't exactly say I was a heavy hitter at that point. And so I did get to see Columbia for 2 weeks, but certainly counting on a full term starting in January.
Well, every teacher who's ever been hired 5 days prior to the first day of school now completely resonates with your experience. And I want our members to get to know a little bit about you. So if you would, tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background and how that shapes your views on education.
Absolutely. So I will start off by saying that I am from a family of teachers. So almost so my parents are divorced and remarried. So all 8 of my grandparents were educators on some level. So that's a big part of it. And I think it's one thing that's been interesting for me is to see what it meant to be an educator to my grandparents. And now my stepmom has just recently retired from the Charleston County School District. My mother-in-law retired from a school up in Greenville. And so seeing the progression of the field has actually been a part of, my experience as well. I grew up here in Charleston. I graduated from Charleston County Public Schools. I have 2 daughters, both of whom are also in Charleston County Public Schools. Brooks is 13, and she was fortunate to be accepted into the School of the Arts 2 years ago for voice. And then my youngest, Lola Kate, is at James Island Elementary School. She just started kindergarten this year.
Well, with a family full of educators, you know a lot about the experiences of teaching. But one of the unfortunate realities about teaching in our state is that we're currently in the midst of a teacher shortage crisis, with over 6,000 teachers leaving the classroom at the end of the last school year, over 500 vacant classrooms to start the year. And that has detrimental impact on our kids. So as a member of the General Assembly, what steps will you be pushing for in the coming session to help our state better recruit and retain teaching talent?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the bottom line here is you've got to pay them a good wage because these are professionals, and you've got to respect their time, period. I know you asked me about my professional background. I'm sorry I sort of stopped short there. For the last 7 years, I've been the city administrator for the city of Folly Beach. And so it was very much within my wheelhouse to be recruiting public sector employees. Nobody goes into teaching or government employment because they're looking to get rich, right? But you do expect to be able to pay rent or a mortgage, to make your student loan payments. I mean, these are the basics. And so if we're not paying teachers enough to pay back the loans that they had to incur to get into the field and in fact live, then we can't possibly expect to retain them. And of course, we've also got to respect their time. Again, these are professionals. I certainly never would have asked anyone on my staff in the city of Folly Beach. And of course, we all take on different tasks and responsibilities vary, but I certainly would never say, hey, this is your job. And I'm also going to take away the time that you have to plan for it. And I'm going to keep on these other responsibilities when you thought you were eating lunch. Right. So, this is through and through. It's a management issue. And I don't mean management I mean funding it on the state level and the district level. So, these are certainly, it's not rocket science how you recruit and retain employees. We know what we need to do, and now it's the time to do it.
Well, that issue of unencumbered time, whether it's planning or, as you pointed out, just being able to have a lunch break, that was encompassed in the Senate's version of the education reform bill that started in the House 2 years ago. Did not pass the General Assembly this year, so this idea of educational reform is likely to show up again next session. Obviously, you would be supportive of unencumbered time and lunch. But what other topics in that area of educational reform do you think would be most essential to see in any sort of final product that makes it through the General Assembly?
Sure. Do you mean as to teacher time or just
Or
in general?
just education, so that education reform bill that covered everything from time to assessment and everything in between. If we're talking about reforming the system, what else besides giving teachers unencumbered time would you really prioritize?
Well, I still don't totally buy this idea that the salary is just a budgetary issue. I mean, we set judge salaries by statute and we set the legislator's own salary. So I don't, I understand that maybe that ship has sailed but I don't totally concede that either. But as far as legislative issues, I think looking at how, looking at the oversight, there are a lot of different committees overseeing education. If we're going to continue to have all those committees, at the very least, they need to be staffed by educators and not political appointees. So that's sort of starting at the top, making sure that our oversight is good, making sure that one of the questions in the questions that you sent was sort of what the most essential piece I thought of 419 was. And the standardized testing, I think, is probably, from my perspective, one of the first things. It looks like there's consensus to get that done. That is an easy and very reasonable, both for our teachers and our students, making sure that the teachers are having, not being burdened by too many tests, and making sure the students have the opportunity to learn. My mother-in-law retired as a 4-year-old kindergarten teacher, and she will tell you that, the children learn through play at that age, and they learn through interacting with their peers, not, rote memorization of sight words and things like that would be on a test. So, those are our youngest students, but it carries all the way through. So let's see, starting with the oversight, we get to the testing, we talked about the protected teacher time. I think those would be you asked me what the priorities would be, so I'll leave it at that. But, obviously the salary's got to be a legislative priority as well.
Yeah, agreed. And I'll just ask, it's beyond the questions that I sent, but I think you've already alluded to it. Come January, assuming stable state revenues, would you support retroactively funding that step increase that teachers were entitled to back in August?
Oh, that's yes, of course. And in fact, we need to be talking about the original raise that they were promised a year ago.
Okay. So you also have talked about funding of our schools in some of your responses, and that's a huge issue because our state hasn't revised our funding formula since the 1970s, and education's changed just a little bit since the 70s. But the state has an obligation to make sure we're providing an adequate education to all students across all zip codes, and we know we're falling short of that. Our state Supreme Court has said as much. Mm-hmm. So as a member of the General Assembly, what steps do you think are necessary, whether it's funding or other, to achieve an equitable education for all kids regardless of their zip code?
Yeah, well, and I think this is another one of those things where it's important, the funding is important. As you say, we haven't changed the funding formula, nor have we fully funded the funding formula. And so that's an important piece of it. But I think it's also important to make sure that our oversight committees are truly staffed by educators, because this is the place where, we determine the priorities. This is how we determine, what kinds of, are we focusing on programs like communities and schools that bring in, the support and the services that teachers need to be able to focus on teaching, so that students who have, either trauma or behavioral issues or other things like that are getting the support that they need. So it's not just any one thing. Unfortunately, I think it's, to succeed means that we are not just doing the minimum, but we are actually, making sure that we are, truly bringing out the best in our schools and our students.
Well, my next question has shifted a little bit since I initially sent these to candidates a while ago, and it deals with the issue of SAFE grants. Governor McMaster's program for private school scholarships out of COVID relief dollars. And what has shifted is the state Supreme Court last week struck it down as a violation of Article 11 of the state constitution. But the governor has said he wants the General Assembly to establish a permanent version of something like the SAFE grants program in the coming session. Holding constitutional issues to the side, whether that's even constitutional anymore based on what the state Supreme Court said, if he comes with that request in his State of the State next year, what is your position on a voucher or private school scholarship program out of public school dollars?
I mean, this is easy. I'm against it. We can barely afford, we're not funding public education as it stands. And I don't know why we would pull hundreds of millions of dollars out of the system. There was a similar or a voucher program proposed in 2019. And I think the estimates there were that we're going to pull 222 million out the first year, 450 million out the next year. So I don't know why we would pull millions out of a system that we're already not doing enough to fund. I'll get a little personal here. So, my husband and I own our house, and I pulled up our tax bill to see what it was that we were paying, because I had a conversation with a voter and they were saying, hey, why not let us, if a student can't get the education they need, why not let them pull their money out and take it elsewhere? And I said, okay, well, so I pulled up my tax bill. And of course, because of Act 388, I'm not contributing to the operating. We're primary residents, so I'm not contributing to the operating. We're contributing $547 to a Charleston County specific capital bond. And so again, to be able to pull $6,000 out per student, the math is not right. So even if you wanted to look at a voucher program, you certainly can't pull $6,000 out per student. And the private schools will tell you that $6,000 is a drop in the bucket compared to their tuition. So the math doesn't add up, the budget's not there, and I have the constitutional issues that you alluded to at the beginning of the question. There's again, my experience as a city administrator, there's a reason that we keep public dollars public. We're not allowed to have private benefit, but more than just the law, you lose the accountability when they move into the private sector. We don't offer a voucher program for other public services. If you choose not to take advantage of them, that's your choice, but you certainly don't get a voucher to do your own thing.
Yeah, a voucher for transportation would be a little bit awkward for everybody.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of educational ground, but obviously there's tons of topics out there. So I want to make sure that our members hear the things that are nearest to your heart, you're most passionate about. So is there anything we haven't covered that you absolutely want to make sure our members know about?
Well, I think the main thing to know is that, I never saw myself as a politician. I didn't get into this because I had some history in politics. In fact, as I mentioned, I come from a family of educators, but I get into this because it's important to me to fight for my kids' future. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Education is absolutely at the top of my priority list for next year. In my role as city administrator, I worked on a lot of environmental projects, and of course that's been something that's been important to me, but we made some progress on that last year. But guess what we didn't make progress on? The educational reforms we needed. So that's at the top of my list. I certainly would also point out, I think one of your questions was about sort of how your professional experience shapes your views on education. And I'll just tell you a short story about that. Prior to being at the city of Folly Beach, I was actually a prosecutor here in Charleston County with the Ninth Circuit Solicitor's Office. And we would, I sat through probably thousands of guilty pleas during my time. You would go to plea court and you had one plea, but there were 75 on the docket. So you would sit through it. And one of the questions that the judge would ask to each defendant as they would come up to plead guilty to determine their capacity to enter a plea was what level of school you completed. And I can say that the percentage of folks who had been accused and were now prepared to plead guilty, so criminal defendants here, probably close to 90% hadn't completed high school. And that to me says it all. That is exactly what we need to be addressing. That's why our schools are so important, because we need, that is the thing to break the cycle of poverty, to keep students becoming productive members of society. If we spent a lot more on education, we'd be spending a lot less on prisons. It's just, it's the key to everything. And so I want all the teachers to know that I don't want to promise the moon, as a freshman Democrat, hopefully in January, I certainly don't believe that I'll be able to move all of the mountains, but I want everybody to know that I'm going to be an ally, and I'm going to be out there fighting for the teachers, because that's ultimately at the end of the day, I'm fighting for my kids.
I don't think you can make a more compelling argument than that. Thank you so much for spending the time with us this afternoon and for your service to our state. We wish you all the best this fall.
All righty. Well, thank y'all so much, and I appreciate your time.